Chapter 11, Island Diary. At dawn, I brought my homemade fishing rod to a large reef. The tide had receded by about half. While low tide isn't ideal for fishing, I trusted that this bountiful sea would bring me some luck. I gathered a few stranded shrimp from the shallow waters and baited my hook, ready for action. Leaving about 15 centimeters of line beneath the hook, I tied a rock as a weight and cast the line out forcefully into the sea. I waited quietly, the line stretching taut. My first attempt lasted a full 30 minutes, but not a single nibble. Speaking of fishing, there are countless automatic fishing devices suggested online, but they're practically useless here. The constant pull of waves, undercurrents, and crabs dragging the bait across the seabed renders them ineffective. 9 times out of 10, they trigger with no catch. After the first cast failed, I began to reel in, but the hook was stuck on the seabed. After much effort, I retrieved the line only to find the hook and weight were gone, nothing left but the bare string. Undeterred, I spent 10 minutes readying everything and hooked a new shrimp before casting again. But after another 15 minutes, still no bite. By this time, the tide had receded by nearly 70%, and the water level had dropped significantly. I scanned my surroundings and decided to try my luck elsewhere, settling on a large rock near the southern cliffs. Here, I could drop the hook straight down into the water. The line was about 4 or 5 meters long, and after testing, I found it didn't touch the bottom, which meant no risk of snagging. Less than 10 minutes later, the bamboo rod in my hand began shaking violently. I quickly pulled back, and the rod bent sharply. This had to be a big one. Sea fish bite with much more force than freshwater fish, and this one was pulling hard. Worried my bamboo rod wouldn't hold, I decided not to rush. Instead, I let the fish tire itself out. After 5 minutes of this standoff, the tension suddenly vanished, the fish had escaped. Disappointment washed over me, my heart sinking like a stone. Fighting the urge to break the rod, I reeled in the line only to find that the hook had snapped. Looking back, the wire I used wasn't strong enough, and given the size of that fish, it was no wonder the hook broke. Determined, I tied on my last hook, thinking, if this doesn't work, I'm out of luck today. Fortunately, persistence pays off. After rebaiting, the rod shook again. The pull this time was weaker, but I didn't dare underestimate it. I carefully reeled in, playing the fish for 7 or 8 minutes, and finally, I landed my first catch on this deserted island. It was a red and yellow fish, weighing about 3 to 4 kilograms. Its belly was golden, and its back faded from red to orange. Its head was oval with sharp dorsal spines, and its round eyes gleamed. It was a red grouper, or sea treasure, as we call it back home. Tender and nutritious, a fish this size would fetch a good price at the market. Thrilled, I grabbed it by the gills and rushed back to my camp with my rod. By 8:45 a.m., I was enjoying a hearty breakfast. I gutted the fish, sharpened a bamboo stick, and skewered it through the mouth. Over a low fire, I roasted it slowly. The aroma of fresh fish filled the air, and soon I couldn't resist tearing off a piece. Even without seasoning, the meat was tender and slightly sweet. I devoured it eagerly, filling my stomach. With this success, I plan to fish more often and explore new ways to cook. I'm particularly excited about the possibility of catching a sea eel. I've had it once in a restaurant, and it was amazing. However, I'm short on seasonings, there's not even salt here. Although eating seafood can naturally replenish some salt, I plan to try making my own sea salt soon, just in case. I also suspect there might be wild ginger and Sichuan pepper growing in the island's forest. These are common in the wild, but it will take time to find them. After breakfast, I headed into the forest to chop sturdy wood for my shelter. My small axe makes this task grueling, and I regret not choosing a saw when I had the chance. Who could have predicted this situation? After cutting down 3 trees, each as thick as my thigh, and trimming the branches, dusk had already settled in. Exhausted, I dragged the logs back to my shelter, my hands covered in blisters. I gazed at the layout I'd scratched on the ground, feeling a wave of frustration. Building this cabin would take an enormous amount of effort. But the thought of a safe and comfortable shelter kept me going. I have no idea how many logs I'll need, so I plan to gather 100 first, stacking them near my shelter to dry in the sun. I'll chop 3 logs a day from Monday to Saturday, reserving Sundays for rest and tourism, exploring the island for more resources. Even though I'm alone here, I want to maintain a routine for my physical and mental well-being, increasing my chances of making it back to civilization. My stomach growled again, but with the tide fully in, I gave up on foraging by the rocks. I still had 2 bamboo shoots from yesterday. I roasted one over the fire and boiled the other in spring water. The roasted one was tolerable, but the boiled one tasted bitter and bland. This only strengthened my resolve to make sea salt. I'm also considering how to get fat. The most realistic source might be from goats, as obtaining plant-based oil seems almost impossible. Even if I found peanuts or olives, I wouldn't know how to extract the oil. Today is Wednesday, and after 3 days of hard work, I'll soon be able to rest. As I lay in my makeshift bed, thoughts of all this swirled in my mind. Slowly, I drifted off to sleep, the flickering firelight casting shadows around me. Chapter 12. Island Diary 2. I woke up early again today and returned to the same rock where I had fished yesterday. Fish has been the most delicious food I've had so far. This time, I caught a bass weighing around 4 to 5 pounds. I also pried 2 oysters off the reef and grilled them alongside the fish. After eating my fill, I still had half the fish left, which I saved for lunch. A light breeze blew in from the east today, from the direction where I had originally landed. The wind brought a pleasant coolness, which felt refreshing on my skin. However, the morning waves were a bit rougher than usual, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Yesterday, I developed several blisters while chopping wood, so I took it easy today and only cut down 2 large logs. Still, one of the blisters popped during the work, and the sharp pain made me wince. Around midday, after a short rest, I decided to get a coconut to drink. I selected a sturdy bamboo pole, tied it to my back with some vines, and headed to the nearest coconut tree. I looked up to see 7 or 8 coconuts hanging from the top of the tree, which stood about 20 meters tall. Unfortunately, my bamboo pole was only about 4 meters long. I have to admit, I'm afraid of heights. Just looking up at those coconuts made me nervous. But soon, I thought of a solution. I tied a long vine around the tree and left 2 loops of slack in the middle, which I then tied around my waist. That way, even if I slipped, I wouldn't fall immediately. This gave me a sense of security, and my anxiety eased. On this island, you have to be cautious about everything. A broken leg or arm could spell disaster. With that in mind, I climbed slowly, inching my way up. Once I was high enough to reach the coconuts, I gripped the tree tightly with my legs, pulled the bamboo pole from my back, and started poking at the nearest coconut. However, the coconut was stubbornly attached. No matter how hard I jabbed at it, it just swayed but refused to fall. Frustrated, I climbed back down, sharpened one end of the bamboo with my axe, and went back up to stab at the base of the coconut. Finally, just as my neck was starting to ache unbearably, 2 large coconuts fell to the ground. Some tasks turn out easier than you expect, but others, like this, are far harder. Every step on this island takes up enormous time and energy. It took me 2.5 hours to get just 2 coconuts. Of course, it's partly because I'm inexperienced. Back at the shelter, I cracked open a coconut and drank the water, then ate the meat. Afterward, I finished the leftover fish from earlier. The coconut provided a bit of carbohydrate, and I felt more energized. By 2 in the afternoon, the wind on the island suddenly picked up. That's when I noticed dark clouds slowly drifting in from the east. A big storm was coming, and it didn't look small. My flimsy shelter wouldn't stand a chance, and my fire had no protection from the rain. The thought of being drenched with no fire, alone on a deserted island, was terrifying. I regretted not paying more attention to the weather earlier. I had no waterproof materials, the only thing I could use was palm leaves. Panic began to set in as I struggled to think of how to stay dry. There were no caves nearby, and finding a hollow tree would be dangerous. It could be full of venomous creatures or worse. And if there was lightning, standing under a tree could turn me into a lightning rod. What could I do? Suddenly, I thought of the damaged inflatable kayak. If I cut it open, it would make excellent waterproof material. I had planned to repair it to attempt an escape, but without glue or thread, it was hopeless. Right now, surviving the storm was more urgent. I had hidden the kayak under some palm leaves and weighed it down with rocks. The leaves had long dried up and turned yellow. I uncovered the kayak and examined it, there was a tear at the bow where it had hit the reef. I decided to cut it in two along the waistline. After untying the rope from the bow, I rolled it up and stored it in my backpack. This thing could be useful later. I used my axe to cut the kayak open, but the rubber was incredibly tough. It took me 2 hours to finish the job. By then, dark clouds had completely covered the sky, and the wind rustled ominously through the trees. The storm was close. I dragged the upper half of the kayak back to my shelter, but quickly realized my flimsy structure wouldn't support its weight. Thankfully, I had cut 5 thick logs over the past 2 days. I leaned 2 logs against a vertical rock, securing the kayak piece on top. I then dragged the bottom half back to block the eastern side. Now, my shelter resembled a 3-sided triangle with one side open. Since the wind was coming from the east, I left the opening facing west, toward the forest. By the time I finished, darkness had fallen. Unfortunately, all my kindling had gotten soaked, so there would be no fire tonight. As the night wore on, the storm hit with full force. Thunder boomed, and rain leaked through the gaps in the shelter, soaking the ground and me. I curled up in the darkness as lightning illuminated the forest, casting eerie shadows that made me imagine monsters lurking within. The howling wind sounded like demons from the depths of hell, roaring around me. I was terrified, afraid the rocks would collapse and bury me, afraid the waves would sweep me away, afraid the lightning would strike, and afraid wild animals might seize the moment to attack. This overwhelming fear tortured me until late into the night. Finally, the thunder eased, and the storm began to die down. Exhausted, I curled up and eventually drifted off to sleep. Chapter 13. After the storm. After a night of torrential rain and howling winds, the island had returned to its usual calm and vitality. When I woke, it was already past 10 a.m. My sleep had been plagued by chaotic and unsettling dreams, visions of myself thrashing in the dark ocean, screaming for help that never came, wild beasts tearing at my flesh, leaving me defenseless. I also dreamt of Gao Deming, smiling as he invited me to join the challenge, only to send me floating into the sky. I had caught a cold. My whole body ached, and my throat throbbed painfully. My clothes were damp, but after the downpour, the sun had reappeared, its warm rays gradually drying my body. Groggily, I pulled myself up and crawled out of the shelter, unable to recall how I had even fallen asleep the night before. I stripped off my wet clothes and hung them on the old shelter to dry, spreading the rest of my gear out on the beach. I rummaged through the first aid kit, found some anti-inflammatory pills, and swallowed 2. The coconuts that had sustained me earlier were now just empty shells. Lying back down on the beach, I unknowingly fell asleep again. When I woke, it was already 4 p.m. I got dressed, packed my gear, and felt a bit better, though clearly not well enough to chop down trees. Instead, I planned to go fishing to fill my stomach. But when I reached the shore, the sea was still murky, the waves high, evidence of the storm's lingering effects. After fishing for a while without success, the tide rose, submerging the rocky area, cutting off my chance of even gathering oysters. Dejected, I made my way back to the shelter. Passing by a coconut tree, something out of the corner of my eye caught my attention. I turned and stared in surprise at a creature scaling the tree. It was a coconut crab. This enormous land-dwelling hermit crab can grow up to a meter in length, and the one before me was as large as a soccer ball. This was the first time I had seen such a massive coconut crab. I knew they typically foraged at night, but perhaps the storm had disturbed its schedule, and here it was in broad daylight. These creatures' powerful claws are strong enough to crack open coconut shells, so I hesitated to approach it directly. I grabbed a bamboo pole I had used earlier to knock down coconuts and cautiously used it to strike the crab. After a few attempts, I managed to knock it off the tree. I stabbed the sharp end of the pole into its abdomen and carried it back to camp. This huge crab was enough to provide a feast. I decided to roast the claws and legs, and make soup with the body. The day's sun had dried the grass, making fire starting easier. I quickly lit a flame using my magnesium block. Coconut crabs have thick shells, and many hermit crabs carry parasites, so I roasted the crab for a full half hour. When I finally pulled it from the fire, it was bright red with a charred shell, and the scent was intoxicating. Despite the heat, I couldn't wait any longer. I broke off one of the claws, larger than my fist, and cracked it open with a stone. Inside, the steaming crab meat was firm and juicy, with a sweet, savory taste enhanced by a hint of coconut flavor, a taste other crabs simply can't match. After devouring the claw, I turned to the soup I had made from the crab's body. To my surprise, the soup had a light layer of oil on the surface. The body of the crab had turned a deep red color, and its aroma was rich and appetizing. If the claw had been light and delicate, the body was robust and savory, filled with roe. Each bite of the creamy roe was a heavenly experience, and I chewed slowly, savoring every bit. Once I had finished the crab, not leaving a scrap of meat in the shell, I drank every drop of the rich broth from my bamboo cup. The subtle coconut flavor mixed with the delicate roe was even more satisfying than the finest green tea. Initially, I had thought this island might be near Australia, but the weather patterns didn't quite fit. Reflecting on our drift time and speed, it seemed unlikely we had traveled that far. Based on the frequent rains and temperature, I suspected we were in a tropical rainforest climate rather than the monsoon climate I had originally believed. Tropical rainforest regions are known for their high temperatures and abundant rainfall throughout the year, with annual precipitation often exceeding 2,000 millimeters. Of course, this was just my rough guess, based on what little I knew of global climates. After the storm, I became more determined to build a proper wooden shelter. I had endured enough nightmares, and starting tomorrow, I would dedicate all my time to cutting down trees, except for when I was eating or sleeping. Only a sturdy wooden house could protect me from the elements and ensure my safety. After dinner, I sat on the beach, watching the sun set over the island. The scattered clouds, mingling with the distant cries of seagulls, created a breathtaking seascape. Suddenly, I heard a noise from the cliffs. A small rock tumbled down, followed by a faint cloud of dust. Curious, I looked up, and my heart froze. Standing on the rocky hillside was a bear. It was unmistakably a fully grown brown bear. Even from a distance, its massive size and thick limbs were unmistakable. Panic set in. I had feared there might be bears on this island, but seeing one in the flesh was terrifying. Brown bears are among the largest terrestrial carnivores, capable of reaching 3 meters in length and weighing up to 500 kilograms. Their powerful forepaws can easily crush a human skull. Some say to play dead when faced with a bear, but that's nonsense. Brown bears are omnivores, eating plants, insects, and mammals, whether alive or dead. Pretending to be dead would offer no protection. A single swipe from its paw could tear me apart. Luckily, the bear didn't notice me. After wandering the rocky cliffs for a while, it eventually disappeared. Chapter 14, Island Diary 3. Today marks the 7th day of my survival on the island. Last night was anything but peaceful. I caught sight of a brown bear. Since my arrival, not a single night has passed without anxiety weighing on me. The moment I wake up, my priority is to find a weapon for self-defense. Currently, my only tool is an axe, which is insufficient against such a large predator. Given the scarce resources here, I initially considered crafting a bow for long-range attacks. Unfortunately, I lacked suitable materials for a bowstring. The ropes and vines are too weak to penetrate the bear's thick fur. Ultimately, I decided to make a practical spear instead. I ventured into the forest, my mind racing with thoughts of the brown bear lurking nearby. I was extra cautious, constantly scanning my surroundings, worried a predator might suddenly appear. To create an effective spear, I needed wood that was both hard and somewhat flexible. After several attempts, I finally found a stick that met my requirements and brought it back to camp. This stick is about 4 centimeters in diameter and a full 1 meter 80 in length. As the saying goes, an inch longer is an inch stronger. I trimmed the branches with my axe, then found a stone to smooth the surface as much as possible. Next, I carved a few grooves for grip and wrapped a thin, soft vine around it to prevent slipping. Finally, I fashioned a pointed spearhead, roasting it over the fire until it was charred, then using a stone to sharpen it further. Holding the spear with both hands, I took a step forward and thrust it. It felt comfortable to wield, slightly heavy but with enough striking power. I decided to carry it with me everywhere. In the days that followed, aside from eating and sleeping, I spent all my time chopping wood. My food sources mainly came from gathering along the shore: crabs, oysters, sea snails, and coconuts. I tried to carve out time for chopping wood. After much effort, my skills improved significantly. I went from chopping only 2 trees a day to managing 7. My arm muscles have noticeably strengthened. Due to the monotony of life here, I decided to record my experiences in a diary. June 28th. Today, I chopped down 5 trees, and my hand developed a blister again. I've gotten used to it. Even if it bursts, I can keep working. June 29th. I was woken this morning by a seagull perched atop my shelter. I tried to catch it, but it flew away. I had hoped to fish today but ended up chopping wood instead, cutting down 5 trees. My total wood count has now reached 28 trees. June 30th. It rained again this morning, but fortunately, it was light and only lasted 3 hours. After the rain, I found a fallen coconut under a tree and ate it. Because of the rain, I only managed to chop down 3 trees today. July 1st. This morning, I gathered along the shore and caught a small snapper. Though it wasn't large, it was fresh and delicious. I cooked it in a bamboo tube, paired with a large crab, 2 oysters, 2 sea snails, and a sea cucumber. Today's hearty meal made chopping wood easier. I managed to cut down 6 trees. July 2nd. Continued chopping wood. Harvested 6 trees. July 3rd. It started raining again today. I suspect we've officially entered the rainy season. The rain was heavy like a few days ago, but the wind was lighter, with no thunder. It occurred during the day, so it had less impact on me. I just got soaked and went a day without food. July 4th. I thought yesterday's rain would only fall during the day, but unexpectedly, it started again late at night. I barely slept. There were leaks in the roof. I went outside several times to fix it, but it was futile. I woke damp and uncomfortable. When dawn broke, I discovered the tide had receded, so I hurried to the rocky area to gather. To my surprise, I found a large iron barrel. This was the first piece of marine debris I had discovered since arriving on the island a month ago. The barrel was rusty, with some faint English lettering that I couldn't quite read. I tested it. It didn't leak, but it was too large for cooking. So, I ground off the rust with a stone, cleaned it up, and planned to use it for water storage. Previously, I had been using a small plastic bottle, which was very inconvenient. With this barrel, I could at least store enough water for half a month. Today, I wasn't feeling great, and carrying water took a lot of time, so I only chopped down 2 trees. July 6th. I finally couldn't resist going fishing again. The fishing process went smoothly this time. I caught a grouper weighing about 5 to 6 pounds. This premium ingredient tastes good no matter how you prepare it. Its flesh is more flavorful than stone carvings. July 13th. After more than a month of effort, I successfully harvested 106 trees, all neatly stacked on the grass not far from my shelter. From a distance, it looks like a massive row. I feel excited. This means I'm not far from moving into a small house. Since the sighting of the brown bear, though I haven't seen it again, I live in fear every night. The night before last, while sleeping in my shelter, I heard animals moving in the forest and occasionally making strange sounds. I felt it must be wild boars, and from the noise, there seemed to be more than one. Holding my spear tightly, I aimed the spearhead outward and stood guard all night. Fortunately, they didn't come to disturb me. Perhaps my campfire provided enough protection. As long as I utilize this wood properly, those thick tree trunks can effectively shield me from any beasts, allowing me to sleep soundly. Today, I don't plan to work. I'll take some time to relax. In the morning, I gathered long leaves and spent half the day weaving a straw hat. It's a wide-brimmed hat with a high center and low sides, perfect for blocking ultraviolet rays. The sunlight here is incredibly strong. My arms have become dark red from sun exposure, and at one point, my skin even peeled off. When I pulled it, whole pieces would come off. Luckily, I've been in the cool forest chopping wood lately. In the afternoon, after the tide rose, I leisurely went fishing with my rod. My fishing skills have improved immensely. I've learned how to avoid rocks and prevent snagging. However, my hook isn't strong enough, so I can only catch fish up to 6 pounds. Anything heavier pulls the hook straight. I caught an eel, a unique spotted variety from the south, covered in white spots, resembling a sea snake. This is a delicacy. On my way back, I picked a coconut. It's worth mentioning that now I don't even need to tie vines when picking coconuts. As the old saying goes, practice makes perfect. For dinner, I had coconut cooked eel. I used coconut juice as the soup base, dipped the eel in boiling water to remove its skin, cut it into pieces, and placed it in the coconut, cooking the whole thing over the fire. The flavor was simply exquisite. Chapter 15. Construction. After living on the island for over a month, I had barely managed to survive by making use of the abundant resources around me. Today, I was finally ready to officially begin constructing my small wooden house. The first step was selecting the site. Due to the limited range of activities available to me during this time, I hadn't explored much of the island's terrain. I had only ventured near the landing area, climbed a nearby hillside close to the cliff, and explored a small patch of woods. However, I felt this area was suitable for living. Although the elevation wasn't high, it was relatively safe, with little risk of water accumulation, and wild animals were rarely present. To the east, there was a large expanse of reefs from which I could gather sea resources, along with a stable source of freshwater. The open view allowed me to spot passing boats quickly and signal for help if needed. Therefore, I planned to build my wooden house here, targeting a spot next to my previous shelter, at the junction of the beach and grassland, about 50 to 60 meters from the rocky hillside. This distance would be safe enough in case of any rockfalls from the mountain. I envisioned a rectangular wooden house, resembling a small flat-roofed structure typical of northern designs. I carefully examined the wood I had on the ground. The initial batch I had cut down had dried to a diameter of about 30 centimeters. To withstand potential attacks from wild animals and endure the strong winds, the walls of my house needed to be sturdy. I decided to set the wood upright into the ground, placing them close together. While this approach wasted some material, it would ensure the structure's strength. According to my plan, the house would measure 10 meters long and 5 meters wide. Given the reduction in diameter after drying, I calculated that I would need about 68 pieces of wood for the long walls and 32 for the short walls, totaling around 100 pieces just for the walls. I first marked the positions of the 4 walls on the ground with wooden sticks, then started digging the foundation. I planned to create trenches for these 4 lines, digging half a meter deep, and neatly arrange the wood to be buried and compacted to ensure the walls were stable. Lacking tools for digging holes, I found a thick bamboo stalk and used my axe to shape one end into a shovel. I also fashioned 2 grips for easier handling and began digging. Fortunately, the island's weather had been consistently rainy, making the soil soft and easy to excavate. When I encountered dry, hard soil, I fetched seawater with a large iron bucket and poured it onto the soil to loosen it. Digging the 4 trenches took me 5 days and consumed 13 bamboo shovels. After finishing the trenches, I began inserting the wood one by one from one corner of the rectangle, placing them tightly together. This task was physically demanding, but fortunately, I had been chopping trees recently, which had helped build my strength. Once completed, I backfilled the soil, compressing it firmly by jumping on it after burying about 20 centimeters. After 3 days of relentless effort, I finally completed the 4 walls. I left a space for a door in the middle of the long wall facing the sea, with a gap of 3 pieces of wood. The height of the cut wood was nearly 3 meters, though each piece varied slightly in height. I buried the taller pieces deeper in the foundation and the shorter ones less so. Now, the tops of the walls were approximately uniform, standing about 2.5 meters above ground level after accounting for the buried portions. Next, I focused on the bottom of the interior. When building a house, it's crucial to consider moisture prevention. I collected many stones of similar size from the mountain and evenly laid them on the ground inside to insulate against ground moisture. I then brought in beach sand to cover the stones. This raised the interior about 30 centimeters above ground level, leaving the roof at a comfortable height of 2 meters and 20 centimeters. Although it felt a bit cramped, I didn't mind. Now, the only issue left was the roof. The roof's structure is arguably the most critical part of the house. It was a top priority. I needed to consider its robustness, wind resistance, and waterproofing. My initial idea was to lay wooden planks neatly on top for simplicity, but considering the island's weather, with its continuous rain, a flat roof wouldn't facilitate drainage. Ultimately, I decided to construct a triangular roof. I kept contemplating and eventually devised a plan. I would chop down 2 taller and sturdier trees to support the roof between the short side walls. I would carve notches at the tops of these 2 wooden supports and place another piece of wood across them. To accomplish this, I spent a day building a scaffold and ladder using thick bamboo. The scaffold was only about 1 meter high, while the ladder exceeded 3 meters in length. After erecting the beams, for safety, I supported each of the 2 main wooden supports with 2 additional pieces, forming a stable triangular structure capable of bearing the roof's weight. Since I didn't have enough wood on hand, I planned to use thinner pieces for the roof, fearing that heavier wood might cause the beams to collapse under the weight. That would be a wasted effort, and I could end up trapped underneath, truly tragic. I spent another 3 days chopping many pieces of wood with diameters of less than 20 centimeters. After taking a break, I measured the distances and carved notches on both sides, snugly fitting them against the horizontal beams. One end was secured to the beams, while the other end was fixed to the long side walls. These seemingly simple steps took me nearly a month to complete, during which I faced 2 heavy rains that halted my work. It was now August 26th. After several rainfalls, I discovered that the roof's waterproofing was not ideal. So, I returned to the woods to chop many sturdy bamboo stalks, cutting them into sections. I then halved them from the top to remove the nodes, splitting the bamboo into 2 layers. The bottom layer formed a U-shape to fit snugly in the gaps of the roof's wood, while the top layer formed an N shape laid over the bottom layer, securely fastened with vines. This way, rainwater would flow down the bamboo from both sides of the roof, significantly enhancing its waterproofing. By now, my small wooden house had finally taken shape, only the door remained to be constructed, and I planned to install windows at both the front and back for ventilation. I also intended to use bamboo for the flooring. After much thought, I decided to start with the floor. I chopped another batch of bamboo. In the wild, bamboo proved to be incredibly useful, and I felt fortunate that the island had a dense bamboo forest. Just like with the roof structure, I first laid a layer of bamboo on the sand inside the house, then arranged the top layer in an N shape. I took off my shoes and stepped on it. It felt quite comfortable. By the time I completed this, it was already 3 in the afternoon. Looking at the small wooden house that had taken shape before me, I felt immense joy, overflowing with happiness that I had no one to share it with. How I wished I could open my phone and tell everyone, look. This is the big house I built. Unfortunately, on this isolated little island, I was all alone. It had been a long time since I last spoke. After the joy faded, a deep sense of loss and dejection washed over me. So what if I built a house? Would anyone applaud for me? Would anyone cheer for me? The answer was no. This was merely a product of my own effort, built solely by me and known only to me. Nothing more. I opened my mouth and let out a couple of soft sounds, but no words came out. On the night of September 5th, 2 months after landing on the island, I finally had a warm little nest. Lying on the floor of my house, tears filled my eyes. I thought of my hometown, of my parents. If they knew I was fighting for survival, alone on a remote island, tirelessly constructing a rudimentary wooden house for 2 months, exhausting myself physically and mentally, my hands calloused and my hair unkempt, how heartbroken they would be. I looked at the roof, closed my eyes, and let the tears stream down my cheeks. Chapter 16, Island Diary 4. I slept exceptionally well this time. The wooden house provided a comforting sense of security. When I finally woke up, it was already 8 o'clock. The wooden structure likely blocked most of the sunlight, which is why this was the first time in nearly a month that I had slept in. Sitting up and stretching, I noticed that the sadness from the previous night had mostly dissipated. Perhaps the recent high-intensity work had left me emotionally tense, leading to my outburst the night before. Reflecting on it, I realized that compared to Captain Wong and Gao Deming, I was undoubtedly the luckiest one. At least I was alive, living on such a beautiful island, breathing fresh air, enjoying high-quality seafood that I couldn't afford before, and admiring the azure sea and sky. I should be grateful. Today, I decided to take a well-deserved break. As for the remaining work in the cabin, I'd tackle it in a few days. For breakfast, I enjoyed a delicious meal of seafood and coconut, followed by a refreshing bath in the sea to wash off the thick layers of dirt that had accumulated on me. My hair and beard had grown long, and without shampoo, I couldn't clean the greasy roots, so I had to settle for looking unkempt for now. After breakfast, with little else to do, I planned to explore the depths of the rainforest to see if I could diversify my monotonous diet. I packed my hiking backpack with a bottle of water and some coconut meat, hung my axe at my waist, and set off with my spear. I walked cautiously through a bamboo grove, venturing deeper into the forest, an area I had never explored before. The untrodden paths of the primeval forest were challenging to navigate, unlike the small trails made by people in the mountains of my hometown. Many places required me to chop through obstructing branches and vines to continue. Not long after, I almost stepped on a colorful little snake, which made me break into a cold sweat. Throughout my journey, I spotted several snakes. Aside from one known as the bamboo viper, I was unfamiliar with the other species and decided to keep my distance, unsure if they were poisonous. As I continued, I discovered many wild cucumbers hanging from the trees. These cucumbers were very small, about the size of my thumb, and covered in sharp spines. Fortunately, these spines were harmless. I tasted a few and found them sour and refreshing, so I picked some and added them to my backpack. I marked a tree every 7 or 8 meters to avoid getting lost. After about 2 hours of walking, I heard the sound of a babbling stream nearby. Following the sound, I descended a slope and found a crystal clear stream. It was about half a meter wide and flowed from south to north. I cupped some water in my hands and tasted it. It was fresh and pure. I guessed the stream's source was the rocks at the mountain peak. I didn't know if there was a lake upstream, but I didn't plan to search today since I didn't have enough time. I feared getting lost if I detoured too much. Next to the stream, I spotted some purple-red plants bearing clusters of purple fruits. This discovery thrilled me because this fruit, called yanyo in my dialect, also grows in my hometown. I used to pick it from the fields as a child but hadn't seen it since adulthood. Later, I learned that its scientific name is Solanum nigrum. I picked a handful and tasted it. It was just as I remembered, sweet and unique. These little fruits were fragile and would crush easily in my bag, so I placed them in a woven pouch above my knees. After resting for a moment, I prepared to cross the stream and continue my journey. However, I unexpectedly stepped into the mud, getting my whole foot stuck and nearly falling flat on my face. Annoyed, I cursed under my breath as I pulled my foot out with great effort. My shoes were now covered in mud, so I planned to rinse them in the stream. I found a spot to sit, took off my shoes and socks, and soaked them in the water. Suddenly, I noticed the mud was very fine and especially sticky when clinging to my shoes. It took considerable effort to clean it off, and then a thought struck me: could this soil be used to make pottery? My excitement surged as I dug into the mud with my hands and pulled out a chunk for closer inspection. This yellow clay contained no sand or gravel and had a high viscosity, making it particularly suitable for pottery. I gathered some broad tree leaves, which are common in tropical forests, and collected a sizable amount of yellow clay, wrapping it up to put in my backpack. I was eager to return immediately to try making pottery, but since I had ventured this deep into the forest, I decided to continue exploring. Crossing the stream and going deeper, I discovered many winding streams, but the water flow wasn't strong. After walking about 2 miles, I noticed small round spiny balls on the ground, some green and others already yellowing. Upon closer inspection, I realized they were chestnuts. Looking up, I spotted a large chestnut tree above me, heavily laden with spiny balls. I pushed aside the grass on the ground and saw many small chestnuts. Wild chestnuts were much smaller than the cultivated ones I usually encountered. This was a good find, rich in starch and carbohydrates. I rarely had access to carbohydrates on the island, and this scarcity had made me increasingly thin. Chestnuts could provide a strong sense of fullness and even serve as a staple food. I didn't plan to take any from the ground to check for spoilage, so I stood under the chestnut tree and used my spear to sweep back and forth. The chestnuts kept falling, and one even hit me on the head, but thankfully, it didn't cause any harm. Some of the fallen fruits were already open, while others needed to be cracked. The yield of wild chestnuts is not as high as cultivated ones. Most fruits contain only 1 or 2 chestnuts, with only a few producing 3. I spent an hour collecting a full backpack of chestnuts, weighing at least 30 to 40 pounds. Feeling very satisfied, I made my way back home. By the time I returned to the wooden house, it was nearly 6 o'clock. Yes, I now regarded my little wooden house as home. At the door, I eagerly started a fire and took out 2 handfuls of chestnuts to roast over the flames. After 10 minutes, a delicious aroma wafted toward me. Using a stick, I poked one out, blowing on it while turning it over with my hands. Once it cooled enough to handle, I gently cracked it with my back teeth, revealing a golden yellow chestnut meat that emitted a sweet fragrance. The shiny texture made me toss it into my mouth to chew. The taste was sweet and starchy, and roasting enhanced the nutty aroma, blending the sweetness of fruit with the fragrance of roasted sweet potatoes. It was crisp like a persimmon, juicy and sweet like an apple, and starchy like a potato, absolutely delightful. Having eaten enough seafood on the island, today was the first time I savored such a delicious staple food. After finishing 2 handfuls of roasted chestnuts, I continued roasting more until I was stuffed, patting my full belly in satisfaction. Chapter 17, Playing with Mud. After dinner, I retrieved the yellow clay I had collected and settled down in front of the fire to examine it closely. I didn't expect this batch to fire successfully. My main goal was to determine if it was suitable for pottery making. I decided to start with a small pot. Clearing my mind, I visualized its shape, then took a piece of clay about the size of my fist and began molding it. I found a flat stone and placed the clay on it, kneading it a few times like dough. However, I soon realized that this was unnecessary. After all, it wasn't dough, and excessive kneading wouldn't help. I clumsily shaped the clay into a round ball, poked a hole in the center with my index and middle fingers, and pinched outwards until the walls were about a centimeter thick. Looking at my creation, I frowned. It was far from beautiful. The pot was crooked, with uneven height and an irregular rim. Fortunately, it was still stable. In a normal society, I would laugh at something like this if someone tried to sell it. I wouldn't even accept money for it. But here on this deserted island, it was my first attempt, and I couldn't afford to be too picky. I carefully placed the pot in the center of the fire to fire it and then continued working on my next art piece. I ended up making 3 of these lopsided little pots, each with a distinct shape, resembling abstract artworks. Next, I attempted to create a plate. This proved easier. I found a piece of bamboo to use as a rolling pin and shaped the clay into a circle. Using a tool made a significant difference, and the plate turned out much rounder. I pinched the edges up slightly, but after finishing, it still didn't quite resemble a plate. It was a bit crooked around the edges. Oh well, that would have to do for now. I didn't expect my first firing to be successful anyway. Though all 4 pieces were uneven, I had put in a solid hour of effort, showing my commitment. I buried them in the center of the fire and added some dry wood on top. Unsure how long they needed to be fired, I decided to ignore them and went inside to sleep. The next day, my first task was to check on the pottery. I brushed aside the covering of wood and ash, revealing 3 dark, oddly shaped pots. 2 had shattered beyond recognition, but the last one looked somewhat intact. Just as I reached for it, however, it cracked in half with a crack. Momentarily stunned, I examined the half I was holding closely. The pottery had a hard texture, proving that the yellow clay I found was suitable for pottery making. However, the surface still felt somewhat sandy. Perhaps the firing temperature was too low or the firing time too short. A light tap caused the pot resting on the stone to shatter. I then dug out the bowl from the ashes. Its condition was much better. The middle had a slight sheen, while only a few cracks formed around the edges. I tested its hardness by smashing it against a stone. The edges crumbled easily, but the middle took more effort to crack, indicating it was much harder and smoother. I concluded that there were 2 reasons for the failure. First, the firing temperature was too low, and the firing time too short. I recalled watching videos about the firing process of Jingdejun ceramics, where the kiln must be sealed and fired for a full day and night at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Though pottery has simpler requirements, I suspected that the temperature from an open fire pit wouldn't suffice. I had tossed the pottery into the fire, where the flames were divided into outer and inner flames. The inner flame was cooler, and I needed to place the pottery in the outer flame for proper firing. Second, my pottery making method was flawed, or my technique poor. I struggled to remember the outdoor videos I had watched. It definitely wasn't just random pinching like I had been doing. This approach not only resulted in unattractive shapes but also made the overall structure uneven and unstable. Different parts of the pottery would vitrify to varying degrees when heated, leading to cracks. Problems needed to be solved one by one. To excel, one must first sharpen their tools. To increase the firing temperature, I decided to build a stove. A simple earthen stove would suffice. I moved the iron bucket used for holding water outside again, intending to fill it with clay. I spent half a day gathering materials from the woods, bringing back 3 large buckets of yellow clay. This clay was heavy. I could only carry half a bucket at a time, as any more would be too much. After 6 trips, I was exhausted and sat down on the ground to begin building the stove. I dedicated an entire afternoon to crafting a circular earthen stove about 60 centimeters in diameter, 1 meter tall, and 10 centimeters thick. I inserted cut bamboo rods into the center at a height of 50 centimeters above the ground, laid down a layer of clay, and dug small holes in it to allow the outer flame to reach the top of the stove for higher temperatures. I smeared clay over the stove's opening, leaving a 30 centimeter diameter hole for placing and retrieving items. Once finished, I planned to let it sit for a few days to dry before firing it, avoiding temperature shocks that could crack the pottery. While waiting for the stove to dry, I began preparing the pottery clay by adding a little less than half a bucket of yellow clay to the iron bucket. Something felt off compared to my last mix. I recalled that others added dried leaves or similar materials. Unsure of the principle behind this, I quickly gathered a pile of dried leaves and mixed them into the yellow clay. I decided to start with a pot again, as it was the most practical. Drawing from my memory of the video, I first shaped the bottom into a circle, rolled it out with the bamboo rod, and created several circular strips of clay. After wetting my hands, I pinched the clay strips one by one from the bottom upwards, making the middle strips slightly longer and the side ones shorter. This technique helped me achieve a round, plump pot shape. When sealing the top, I used a thicker clay strip to reduce the chances of cracks forming at the opening. In the end, a well-shaped pot body emerged. I continuously smoothed the pot with my damp hands, striving to make it as even and firm as possible. I crafted 2 more pots and, using the same method, made 2 bowls and a cylindrical cup with a carefully crafted handle. Finally, I fashioned the simplest plate. This was the most exquisite and meticulous work I had done since arriving on the island. After 2 full days of playing with mud, I felt more exhausted than I would have been after a day of chopping trees. I stretched my stiff neck and yawned, placing the pots in a shady spot to protect them from the harsh sunlight. Now, all that was left was to wait for the stove and the pottery to dry before firing. Chapter 18, Hunting. September 8th. Today, I checked the clay pots. They still haven't dried out. Since arriving on the island over 2 months ago, I've eaten nothing but marine life, no meat. However, today I plan to venture into the forest to see if I can catch some small animals to improve my diet. When it comes to hunting, the most practical tool at my disposal is a small trap. I can use it to catch animals like squirrels, field mice, rabbits, and lizards. I've seen these creatures while exploring the forest, but their speed is too quick for me to catch them by hand. Thus, I began to contemplate what kind of trap would be most suitable. For capturing small rodents, the simplest and most effective method involves 3 small sticks supporting a large stone. By placing bait on one stick, the trap will trigger once the animal touches the food, causing the stone to come crashing down. This trap is straightforward to set up. I gathered a handful of small sticks, selecting some about 1.5 centimeters in diameter, which is the optimal thickness. If they are too thick, the trap won't trigger properly. If too thin, they may not support the stone's weight, leading to misfires or even breaking. Thus, the sticks must be straight. The trap consists of 3 sticks, 2 long and 1 short. I cut the long sticks to 20 centimeters and the short stick to 15 centimeters. To increase sensitivity, I peeled the bark from the tops. The 3 sticks function as the diagonal, horizontal, and vertical supports, forming a triangular structure that stabilizes each part. Using one of the long sticks as a diagonal support, I sharpened both ends at the same angle and carved a triangular notch in the center. The horizontal stick was also a long one. I carved a notch about 1 centimeter from one end, shaped to catch the diagonal stick's corner, while the other end was sharpened to hold the bait. The vertical stick, the shorter one, was slightly thicker, with one end shaped into a triangle to fit into the notch of the diagonal stick. After finishing the 3 sticks, I found a heavy, flat stone. Once I assembled the triangular frame, I pressed down on it with one hand while lifting one side of the stone with the other, gently placing it on top of the diagonal stick, then slowly releasing both hands. Perfect, it held up. I placed another stick gently at the bait position, and bang! The stone slammed down onto the stick. Success. A word of caution: if you try making this type of trap, always set the bait before assembling the frame, or you might crush your hand. I used to catch grilled Jerry the mouse with this trap, and I've become quite skilled at it. I repeated the process, crafting 5 sets of these traps, stowing them in my bag before heading into the forest. The stone was too heavy to carry, so I sourced materials on site. I found the chestnut tree I discovered last time and thought many small animals would visit here. I often see squirrels jumping between the nearby trees. I set up 5 rock drop traps, placing 3 with gathered chestnuts and 2 with picked black nightshade berries. I marked each trap's location to avoid losing them when I return. Now, I just need to wait. I plan to check the results tomorrow morning. I also gathered around 10 kilograms of chestnuts, eating some with each meal. They taste great. This chestnut tree is quite large, bearing many immature fruits, enough to keep me fed for a while. By the time I returned to the campsite, it was already noon, and I still had plenty of time. After a quick meal, I decided to set some more traps. This time, I targeted the mountain, specifically the area where I spotted goat activity during my last exploration. I prepared to set up 2 snare traps there and hoped for some luck. I had a 10-meter-long cable made of strong blue nylon material. I believed it wouldn't break even if snagged by a brown bear. I found 2 short, thick pieces of wood, about 5 centimeters in diameter and 10 centimeters long. Then I got a long stick, 2 centimeters in diameter and 1 meter long. First, I cut a notch about 3 centimeters off the ground on the 2 thicker sticks, ensuring the notch was just right to hold the long stick. I tied one end of the rope into a loop, so that when the other end was pulled tight, the noose would shrink around the prey above. The more force applied, the tighter the noose became. I laid the noose on the ground, wrapped the rope a distance behind it around the middle of the thin stick, and secured it in the notches of the 2 thick sticks. The other end of the rope was tied to a small tree or branch, ensuring the branch had sufficient flexibility and sturdiness. By bending the branch and pulling the rope tight, the thin stick could be firmly wedged between the 2 thick sticks. When an animal touched the thin stick, it would fall away, pulling the rope tight. If the noose caught the animal's leg, the tension would increase, eventually capturing it. Equipped and ready, I set out. Honestly, ever since encountering the brown bear, I've felt quite scared in this area. I'm always cautious when fetching water, carefully collecting it at the foot of the mountain. However, the thought of the rewards from capturing a mammal kept pushing me to take the risk. 2 hours later, I arrived near the goat tracks I discovered last time. Unfortunately, the tracks had been washed away and blurred by the rain. I found 2 narrow spots between trees and used sturdy branches as tension sources to set up my traps, then quickly headed down, picking many prickly pear fruits along the way. These fruits had ripened nicely, their deep red color particularly striking under the sunlight, many having fallen to the ground and stained the soil red. In total, I set up 7 traps, feeling excited. How wonderful it would be to catch a goat. Just imagining roasted whole goat, goat soup, and lamb skewers made me swallow hard. However, capturing such prey requires immense luck. Goats are vigilant and agile. I've seen brown bears on the island and heard sounds resembling wild boars, but I've never seen a trace of goats, only able to judge by their footprints. Furthermore, the northern mountain is vast, who knows where they roam. The chances of capturing one are indeed slim. All I can do now is wait silently. I leisurely walked back home, and by the time I returned, it was 6 o'clock. I fished for a while and caught a grouper, then started a fire in front of my home. No matter how delicious something is, I can't handle eating it every day. I no longer find the fish as tasty as before. After finishing, I roasted some chestnuts over the charcoal, sitting in front of the fire while gazing at the sea, contemplating what to prepare for tomorrow. My wooden house isn't completely finished yet, the door isn't installed, and the 2 planned windows haven't been cut out. I need to finish these soon. A wooden house without a door isn't very secure, and for the past few days, I've kept the fire near the entrance to deter wild animals. I also plan to make some furniture. A bed is a must, along with a table and chair, and I even plan to create a stove inside the house. Tomorrow, I'll focus on finishing the door and windows for the house. With this resolve in mind, I slowly fell asleep inside. Chapter 19, Island Diary 5. September 9th. This morning, I enjoyed some roasted chestnuts, and the pottery clay is almost ready to be fired tomorrow. Today, I plan to construct the door and windows for my wooden house. Before diving into that, I checked the traps once more. As expected, the 2 rope traps on the hillside hadn't been triggered and remained unchanged from yesterday. I examined them carefully and found no issues. However, 3 traps in the forest had been triggered. When I moved the stones aside to inspect, I discovered nothing inside. The bait had been devoured. At that moment, I spotted a bloody tail beneath one of the stones. It belonged to little Jerry. I felt a pang of sorrow. Of the 3 triggered traps, 2 had used nightshade berries as bait. Determined to catch something, I gathered a large handful of nightshade berries, hanging some on the bait sticks and scattering the rest around the traps. My hope was to lure those poor creatures that had grown complacent from the delicious food. I also replaced the stone used to crush prey with a larger one. Once I completed these tasks, I strolled back to the campsite. On my way back, I stumbled upon a wild pineapple. From a distance, it resembled an oval green ball topped with sharp leaves, covered in tiny thorns. This was my first encounter with a wild pineapple, and I had never tasted one before. I expected it to be very sour and astringent, but to my surprise, it was unexpectedly sweet. The flesh of the wild pineapple was slightly white, less juicy than cultivated ones, yet it had a crisp and refreshing taste. Most importantly, it was not astringent at all, leaving no tingling sensation in my mouth after eating. Compared to cultivated pineapples, wild pineapples are much tastier. It reminded me of autumn persimmons. The soft ones are very sweet but can leave your mouth feeling numb if you eat too many, while the crisp ones are sweet and crunchy without any astringency. I quickly finished the small wild pineapple, wandering around in search of more but found none. Back at the wooden house, my first task was to reinforce the walls. Near the top and bottom, I carved 5 cm deep grooves, taking care not to damage my little home. Next, I cut several pieces of wood matching the grooves, thickness and fitted them one by one, connecting the entire wall for even weight distribution. This would prevent any sudden tilting or collapse of the structure and prepare for the window construction. Then, I marked the exact positions for 2 windows on the east and west sides of the house, one facing the sea and the other toward the forest. Using my axe, I gently chiseled along the marked lines, spending the entire morning carving out the window frames. As I completed this, light flooded into the house. Next came the window construction. I chose to use bamboo for the windows, as it is lighter than wood. I laid out 10 suitable bamboo stalks side by side and drew a square the same size as the window on top, cutting off the excess parts. I then carved holes of the same size at both ends of each bamboo stalk and threaded them with sharpened wooden sticks, tightly assembling the bamboo. After trimming the excess wooden sticks, this would serve as the installation for the window frame. Finally, I made 2 small holes in the appropriate spots on the wall's window frame. I took a wooden stick of the same thickness and vertically threaded it through the middle of the bamboo on the far right side of the window, fitting the stick into the small holes of the frame. This completed a fully operable window. During the day, I could open it for ventilation, and at night, I could close it for safety. I applied the same method to create another window, adding bamboo bolts inside both windows to prevent them from being blown open by strong winds. For the door, I used a similar approach. Since I had previously reserved 3 gaps in the wood, there was an opening in the middle of the entire wall. I planned to use 2 thick wooden sticks, each 90 centimeters long, fitting them horizontally across the top. The door would be 180 centimeters high, with another horizontal piece at the bottom to prevent rain from flooding inside during extreme weather. With the door and windows installed, I finally felt truly at ease at night. Even without a bonfire, I no longer had to worry about beasts harming me. My next plan was to dig a drainage ditch around the house. The location of the house was neither too high nor too low, so rainwater wouldn't normally flood inside. However, I always believed in being prepared. What if a typhoon hit? Thus, I used the bamboo shovel from last time to dig a 30-centimeter deep drainage ditch around the house, directing the outlet toward the beach. I split some thick bamboo in half, removing the nodes in the middle, and laid them down in sections, compacting both sides with gravel to improve drainage. After spending the entire day on these tasks, I also planned to build a fence around my little house, transplanting some wild fruits and trees inside, and even raising small animals. Next to the wooden house, I wanted to build a shaded area where I could work comfortably during the day, as well as a wood storage room to ensure the timber stayed dry. I wanted to avoid the situation where I wouldn't have dry wood during rainy days. However, this was a significant amount of work and would require a lot of bamboo, wood, and vines. I was in no rush. These improvements were aimed at enhancing my quality of life rather than being mere necessities. After all, my house was meant to ensure my safety. After dinner that night, I let the fire burn until it extinguished. In the past, I had to get up several times throughout the night to add firewood to the bonfire, but now, with doors and windows, I slept more soundly, completely relaxed and immersed in dreams. September 10th. Today, while tide pooling, I unexpectedly discovered a piece of foam board tangled with a mass of fishing net. The fishing net was complicatedly entangled, with many holes, rendering it temporarily useless, so I tossed it in the corner of the little wooden house. But at night, while swatting mosquitoes inside the house, I suddenly thought I could use this torn fishing net to make 2 screens. These would prevent mosquitoes from flying in when I opened the windows for ventilation during the day. The mosquitoes on the island were particularly numerous and bothersome, buzzing around my ears like bombers at night. One day, a large wasp flew into the house, and it took considerable effort to chase it out. With screens, these annoying creatures would no longer be able to enter. I made a frame the size of the window using thin bamboo, patiently entangling the fishing net bit by bit. I didn't need to completely untangle it, just breaking it down into smaller sections was sufficient. Then, I carefully wrapped it around the frame, ensuring multiple layers, with smaller gaps in the net for better effectiveness. After finishing the 2 screens, I affixed them to the outside of the windows. From now on, when I opened the windows, they would only open inward, but this wouldn't affect usability. Chapter 20, Grilled Little Jerry. September 11th, it rained lightly last night. I checked 7 traps and found that the rope trap on the hillside had not been triggered, but 2 traps in the woods had. In one of them, I caught a large, little Jerry. This brownish-yellow field mouse was flattened by a heavy rock. Field mice belong to the hamster family, and compared to common mice, they are sturdier, with shorter tails and relatively smaller eyes and ears. I grabbed little Jerry by the tail, lifted it up, and after resetting the trap, I returned to camp. Let's start cooking. Just kidding, my only cooking setup is a fire pit. The next scene might be quite bloody, so I recommend that minors and sensitive viewers watch with adult supervision. I eviscerated the flattened field mouse, washed it in seawater, removed its innards, and skewered it on a stick before roasting it over the fire. This little guy carries many germs. I remember diseases like the plague and rabies, so I made sure to cook it thoroughly. After roasting for nearly 20 minutes, the surface of the field mouse became charred, releasing an enticing aroma reminiscent of roasted quail. I peeled off the charred skin to reveal golden, oily mouse meat, which was surprisingly chewy and the most delicious thing I had tasted since arriving on the island. It contained the unique fat of animals, and because I roasted it for so long, even the small bones were crunchy and easy to chew. I quickly devoured this little Jerry, wiped my mouth, and savored the lingering taste. After eating my catch, I prepared to start the kiln for pottery. After 2 days of drying, the surface of the clay stove was covered with numerous fine cracks, but they were not deep, and the overall structure remained intact, making it usable. The surface of the pottery was very smooth, with no cracks appearing. This might be because I kept it in a cool place, away from direct sunlight, allowing the moisture to evaporate completely, leaving it dry and gritty to the touch. I ignited a fire in the fuel opening I had reserved at the bottom of the clay stove and filled it with dry firewood, causing thick smoke to rise. Covering my mouth and nose, I fanned the flames with large folded leaves. Soon, flames erupted from the inner opening, burning vigorously. I placed a ceramic jar into the top opening and filled it with small branches, causing the flames in the clay stove to soar. After about an hour of burning, during which I kept adding firewood to maintain the highest temperature possible, I impatiently took out the ceramic jar to check the results. The jar felt warm to the touch, its color had deepened from light yellow to a slightly reddish hue, and it was intact with no signs of cracking. I set it on the ground and tapped it, producing a clear, clang, sound, but the surface still felt somewhat gritty and far from the solid pottery I had seen before. Was it due to insufficient firing time, or was the temperature not high enough? I decided to test the jar's waterproof capability by filling it with seawater and setting it quietly beside the wooden house. By noon, I noticed the internal sediment falling off the jar, and the seawater turned slightly yellow and murky. By evening, water began to seep from the bottom of the jar. When I tapped it with my finger, a piece broke off with a pop, spilling seawater everywhere. I picked up a shard to examine it and could clearly see that seawater had soaked half of the jar wall. I could easily scrape off the yellow mud with my fingernail. This pottery firing ended in failure once again, but I had figured out some techniques. At least the shaping structure of the jar was fine. The last problem was to solve the vitrification of the pottery. One solution was to extend the firing time, which was simple. The other was to increase the temperature inside the clay stove. Fanning with leaves required considerable effort and had limited effectiveness, so I thought of using a blower. September 12th. Today, I had no luck with the traps again. I returned to the small river in the woods and collected a large amount of yellow clay. I planned to use this clay to make a high-efficiency blower. First, I marked off an area with the yellow clay about 50 centimeters in diameter and 20 centimeters high, not far from the clay stove. Then I dug a deep pit in the center and inserted a thin bamboo stick. I polished the inside of the bamboo very smooth, cutting a stick 60 centimeters long, just the right thickness to fit inside the bamboo, and polished it smooth as well. Next, I carved a cross-shaped groove at the bottom of the stick, with a depth of 16 centimeters. This step was quite challenging. I worked very carefully and wasted 3 sticks before carving a suitable one. Then, I cut 2 flat wooden pieces, each 45 centimeters long and 16 centimeters high, with a thickness matching the groove of the stick, and inserted the bamboo pieces crosswise into the groove. I inserted the stick with the bamboo pieces into the center of the small pit, moving it back and forth to generate a strong breeze. I covered the top of the blower with bamboo pieces and sealed it with yellow clay, leaving only 1 stick protruding. Finally, I dug a hole in the side of the blower facing the clay stove, connecting it to the bottom of the stove with a section of bamboo that gradually changed in thickness, sealing the gaps with yellow clay to prevent air leaks. Thus, the entire blower structure was completed. I tried moving the stick, and the effect was excellent. Each movement caused the flames in the stove to leap higher. I took another ceramic jar, prepared everything, and started firing. This time, I fired it for 3 hours straight, constantly moving the blower. My palms had developed thick calluses, and I ended up with 2 blisters during those 3 hours of fanning. After stopping the fire to cool for an hour, I pulled out a ceramic jar that felt as smooth as porcelain. Looking at the light red, slightly shiny jar in front of me, I knew it was a success. I filled the jar with seawater for testing. Next, I lit the fire again, completing the firing of the remaining jar, 2 bowls, and a cup all at once. In the end, I had developed 3 more blisters on my hands, but I ended up with 1 ceramic jar, 1 ceramic bowl, and 1 broken-handled ceramic cup. 1 bowl cracked, and the handle of the cup broke. However, this did not affect their use. I could drink water from the cup and cook soup in the jar. Although bamboo tubes could also cook soup, it was risky. There were several times when I tried to use them for fish soup, and they would crack with a bang, spilling the soup everywhere and wasting my hard-earned ingredients. Looking at the pottery on the ground, resembling high-end art, I smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. This added a touch of warmth to my home. I carefully placed them inside, arranging them as if opening an exhibition, admiring them for an entire evening. Even while sleeping, I glanced at them as I drifted into dreams.